Well, the robot voice was to be my cue. So here we are. Friends, it's good to be with you this morning. And on behalf of A Rocha Canada, it's an honor to walk with you at least a little way, exploring the connections between caring for creation and following Jesus. This morning, we want to take one tact at opening the scriptures with the knowledge that we live in a time of deep ecological significance. I worry that I may stretch your attention span a little bit. I hope that you'll forgive me. Let's begin with a prayer. Creating, redeeming, sustaining God, we seek your light and your enlightenment. Show us anew how your creation is an expression of your love, and how we might be caught up in that love. And God, lead us not to panic or apathy, but to faith and to hope and to love. Once someone mentions it, it's obvious. The Bible is an outdoor book. Someone has said, and I haven't chased down the footnote, but someone has said that we spend about 90% of our time indoors. That was not true for the people of the Bible. Most of the action in the Bible takes place outside. The thought that I want you to consider today is not just that the Bible is an outdoor book, but that the Bible's core message has deep ecological significance. Ecology, of course, is the study of connections. It's those connections that make up the web of life. So here, once more, some of the verses from John's Gospel. Imagine the scene. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time Jesus had appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. As you look at that scene in your mind, do you see the connections? You can almost see the web of life itself in that image, can't you? Jesus is hosting the breakfast. He's providing for his friends, his students. And they, still befuddled, I think, by Easter, went out to catch fish. They caught these fish that were connected to the rest of the aquatic ecosystem. And the bread that was served was made, no doubt, from grain from some local field. And so it was connected to the invertebrates and the microbes in the soil. And yes, the breakfast was being cooked over charcoal. Energy released from the wood, originally from the sun. And at the center of the web is Jesus, host, cook, teacher, and apparently a fishing savant. In my own tradition, we would call this lakeside breakfast an image of communion. In the first chapter of Colossians, Paul unfurls a description of Jesus that is, well, it's almost breathtaking. Paul says Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and that through Jesus, all things were created, and through him, God was pleased to reconcile all things, to make peace through the blood of the cross. So friends, let's gather around this image. Jesus on the lakeshore, the side of fire, welcoming his friends and students, and welcoming you and me. Jesus, having been raised by the power of the Spirit, is reconnecting reconciling, and bringing the gift of renewed communion. In a world that's not yet fully transformed by Easter, this gift of communion is also a gift of vocation. Yesterday, I was participating in our denomination's annual meeting. And our financial director happened to mention that during the audit process, one of the key auditors was participating from India. In some ways, our lives are stunningly connected, aren't they? And yet in other ways, we're even less connected than were Jesus and that clutch of students and friends on the lakeshore. Even if that group of people could not have spoken in detail about the transfer of energy and nutrients, they would have known that their lives depended on plants and other animals. They had pulled fish from the lake. They would have seen a lamb on the hillside one day and on the roasting spit the next. And they would have known the worry and the joy of watching fields grow. They would have touched the seed. They would have felt the rain and the sun. They would have shared with the psalmist the sense of God's care through these things and for these things. And they would have known intuitively, if not in a technical sense, that the waste of one organism is very often the food of another. Their world, humans, plants, other creatures, the Creator, was a very connected place. And when their world was squeezed by the poet's imagination, the psalmist perhaps, it dripped with God's love and glory. But for many of us, our lives are different. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, but certainly different. We obviously still depend on the web of life. We couldn't breathe without the work of trees and other plants. We couldn't enjoy our breakfast without the work of pollinators and soil microbes. Our food, our clothing, and the materials that make up our homes, it all comes from somewhere. But we largely don't know where that is. Our plants in our home area still leaf and bloom at certain times, and their populations are quite specific to our place. But we're largely ignorant of it. And our waste still goes somewhere, but it's hard to know where that is and whether or not it's harmful to those creatures that seek to make a living in it. And so we live in a world that is at once very connected and also disconnected. You probably know that the words used for soil and for human in the early part of Genesis have the same root. Adam and Adamah, like human and humus. So theologically, we are creatures of the land. I think we could say of the lake as well. But the promise and the peril of the modern world is found in messing with those connections. Being creatures who depend on the land and the lake is frightening, and so our economies have set up countless workarounds. Not wanting to depend on the limitations of local agriculture, we now import from around the world. Not wanting to be limited by the ability of our own watershed to deal with our waste, we export it to who knows where. And many of these workarounds have become so normalized that we no longer even see them. Like my friend in university whose manual transmission car required a rubber band to keep the stick shift from losing its place. After a while, she failed to even notice the problem. It was others of us who tried to drive her car that noticed the problem. These workarounds have become normalized. We hardly even see them. And yet there are signs that they're not very sustainable. Some contemporary analysts have begun using the term nature deficit disorder to describe the impact, the psychological impact of our disconnection from the natural world. And many of you, I'm sure, know that we are losing entire species of plants and animals faster than we can even identify them. According to a summary that was drawn up by the Smithsonian, the rate of extinction is now hundreds or even thousands of times higher than the background rate. This is largely driven by human activity, overharvesting, change of land use, pollution of various kinds. In the not too distant past, there were times when rivers around the Great Lakes were so overrun with industrial pollution that they literally caught fire. Over the last 34 years, a combined $22.78 billion US have been spent on cleanup, and much more is required. And because the connections between our lives and the lives of other living creatures are so obscure, it's hard for us to own up to the invisible carbon pollution and the impact that it has on others. In Romans 8, Paul says that creation itself has been subject to futility. Creation is in bondage, waiting to be set free. Creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. If creation has groaned in the first century on account of the repercussions of misguided human choices, how much more in our own time? I know this sounds like finger wagging, but what I'm not trying to set up is a policy agenda or yet another indication of our inadequacy. What I want us to see is the space that is open in our lives and in our neighborhoods and in our watersheds for God's grace and beauty. The grace and beauty of reconciliation that we see in the breakfast shared by Jesus and his friends. They gathered in the company of Jesus. Connections and relationships restored by the power of the resurrection. That communion moment was a sign that creation was being set free. And the invitation to participate in that breakfast, bread, fish, water from the lake, was an invitation to a way of life rich in thanksgiving and rich in connection. A life of fully orbed reconciliation and hope. A life of rootedness in the goodness of God's creation, which can only really be known by getting to know a specific place. If we're Easter people, people of the empty tomb, and people who know of God's self-offering love, we are also people of reconciliation. We're people of resurrection. And yes, one long ignored facet of this reconciling work is with the natural world, with God's good creation, life's web of which we're a part. What I think is that the great joy of this aspect of following Jesus is frankly the fact that it is a joy. It's like that sense of relief that you feel when you resolve a conflict with a friend, that deep exhale of satisfaction. Being reconciled with the land and the water around us is much the same. Jesus knew where the fish and the bread he served came from. I wonder if we do. If not, there's a fascinating puzzle to be solved. Jesus knew the rhythm of the flowering and fruiting plants in his area. Do we? Do we know if we could eat fish, in fact, from the lake just south of us? If not, why not? The disciples looked at and counted each of the fish that they caught. What kinds of fish live in Lake Ontario? Is this the same as the kinds of fish that lived there 100 years ago? How many fish are there? What is an eel? Why do they live in Lake Ontario but not in the other Great Lakes? Do our lives help or harm a creature like the American eel? Jesus knew the source of the energy that was used to cook his lakeside breakfast. What's the source of the energy that's used to cook our breakfast? And what impact might that have on farmers in the global south? When we really begin exploring these connections within our home region, we sometimes find a joy of learning and exploration that matches what we encounter when we travel to some faraway destination. If you need a testimony, ask anybody who's taken up birding during the pandemic. Let me close with this. Rebuilding these connections is a profoundly hopeful process. How could it not be? We get to participate in the Creator's work of renewing, freeing all things. This is our vocation in one form or another. And it's here that we, like Peter and the other disciples, hear Jesus saying, "Come, follow me." Loving God, may it be so for each of us. Amen.